Welcome to Mixed Martial Arts, guys. I'm fixing my hair because I feel like the earphones, and usually my hair is much fuller, much thicker. It's a mane, like Thor's. That's the women in my family talking in the background. Today, I'm really excited. We have Dr. Jordan Peterson on, and the podcast, I think, went really well. We talk about the self-authoring program, but of course, we got sidetracked in the beginning about some important issues that I think are going to relate to your self-authoring program. So I hope you enjoyed it. I had a great time, as usual, talking to him. He's a towering intellect. You know, I listened to you on Rogan after you had done our podcast, and I think I texted Joe. I said, he's a modern day prophet in the Old Testament vein. He's coming here and telling us that the house is on fire. Let's listen. And it's been such a joy to watch you kind of get your message out. So you're an important
I've been
voice.
very fortunate. I haven't been consumed by the flames yet. So isn't that something amazing?
Well, I enjoy watching how you're constantly mischaracterized. It's great. And then I ask them if they've actually listened to you, and of course they haven't. So,
well, the funniest thing that happened, so when I made these videos about this crazy Canadian legislation, Bill C-16, that's when I got my reputation, let's say, got attacked, and I got called everything that you could possibly call someone on the hypothetically far right of the spectrum. I got called a transphobe and a bigot and a racist, and then more recently, a neo-Nazi, and then even Hitler by the professor at Wilfred Laurier University, and where there was a scandal recently that you may or may not know about. But
I do. I listened to it.
It's exactly the scandal I predicted when I talked about Bill C-16. And what's so interesting is that so many of the people who've been attacking me over the last month, again, because I guess they've got their backs up about the fact that they've been put against the wall because of what happened at Wilfred Laurier, all start out saying, well, he's a racist and a transphobe and a bigot, but he was right about this, without ever realizing that the only bloody reason they ever characterized me that way to begin with, and this is the only reason, is because I warned about exactly this a year ago. So it's perverse.
Do you think that you are at least, it feels like you are at least winning the debate, or certainly appealing to mass reason, if there is such a thing?
Well, we should take that apart carefully, because it's not a debate I want to win.
Yes.
Partly because I also don't think of it as a debate. Because I don't think that in a situation like this there can exactly be winners without there being losers. And the fewer losers we stack up, the better, because losers tend to get vindictive and bitter.
I think you're right, Jordan. I want to stop there because every time I see, even when your videos are featured, it's like Jordan Peterson crushes left-wing, whatever. And it's always this sort of like very aggressive, aggro, sort of prototypical sort of caveman terminology. And I do think that we are in this country, and I talk about this in my stand-up, I think that we have broken up into these teams, and people are far more interested in punishment than they are persuasion, because of course persuasion is much more difficult. It's much harder to define what you are for, and much easier to define, or at least act out at what you're against, because usually that's informed by your feelings and your fast thinking. Don't you think so?
Yeah, I do. Well, the problem with framing it as win-loss is that you still end up living with the losers. And that's not good when in some sense in the U.S., I think it's more particular in the U.S., like you guys are polarized almost right down the middle. It's pretty much 50-50. And it's just not helpful to have half of those people losing and the other half winning, because you're stuck with each other. And what I've been trying to do over the last year, one is defend myself. And, I would say that some of the accusations about me being aggressive or angry have been a consequence of the defense I've attempted to mount under circumstances that I think were genuinely difficult. Like, for a few months, the status of I would say my career as a university professor, but also as a clinical psychologist, was seriously in doubt. And so I might have been a little bit more reactive and irritable during that period of time. But since then, I've been basically trying to convince people that the right way forward through all this is to drop the identity politics on both sides of the spectrum and to act in an individually responsible manner, and to understand that that's the idea that the West got right.
Well, I loved how you broke down intersectionist feminism, and if you keep extrapolating, you get to the individual. I mean, you can.
Oh yes, well that's very comical.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, it is. It's so funny because it's so funny that the logical flaw in the identitarian argument manifested itself in intersectionality almost instantly, and they just obviously they haven't taken it to the logical conclusion. But it's forced. That realization will be forced upon them in due course. That's why the LGBT acronym keeps growing.
Yeah. Well, when I guess it's a big responsibility when you develop a following the way you have, because you have developed a following, sort of this movement. And you have to be careful, of course, not to be, you can be cast as a leader of a cult, or you can be cast as a leader of whatever it might be. And I guess, and I love how you're kind of like reminding everyone who follows you that the idea that there are winners and losers is always a dangerous thing, because losers are not, they're not convinced. They're not. Their hearts and minds are not changed. And so
they're not your friends.
Yeah, in a way, it's almost like you're raking. You're like a rake, and you're raking all the leaves that already belong to your tree over to one side. If but I do think that your speeches and your just the way you speak and does, at least if it doesn't change minds, it helps people articulate how they've been feeling, because this stuff doesn't sit right with them, and they don't know how to fight it. So a lot of people end up being quiet.
Or they end up being, see, one of the things that's happened very, very frequently to me over the last year, and I would say this is hundreds, if not thousands of letters. They're from people, mostly young men, who said, I'm pretty tired of being castigated for my toxic masculinity, and I've been drifting towards the far right, and your lectures have helped me figure out how to articulate my opposition to what's happening on the leftist identitarian front without being, what would you say, propelled over to the opposite extreme. And so that's a really good thing. I mean, it's exactly what you'd hope for. And I certainly don't have any friends among the hardcore identitarian right, because they know perfectly well that I think they're playing the same game, to the degree they pay attention to me. They know that I'm opposed to the game they're playing on the same grounds that I'm opposed to it on the left. Because
they think in a similar way. Is that what it is?
Well, the first issue is, and this is a very important issue, is what element of your identity should be paramount? And the answer to that is there's different levels of analysis. You could say, well, individual would be the first one, and then there would be group, and then the question would be, well, what group? Family, state, country, race, who knows? There's all those variants of group. And the identitarian types pretty much go towards the highest level abstraction. It's gender or sex or race. And that's not good. Partly because what happens is that then those on the right, who are the ethno-nationalist types, think, okay, if you want to play group identity, well, we're perfectly happy to play that. But we're going to play exclusionary group identity while you play inclusionary group identity. But they have just as much justification for it. If it's about race, then you shouldn't be surprised when people make it about race. If it's about race, then we're in trouble, man.
Right. One is obsessed with inclusion. The other becomes obsessed with exclusion.
Well, what we figured out, my students and I, we thought, well, what happens is you get a push for homogeneity on the left. But the homogeneity is everyone's going to be in the same group. So that's the left homogeneity. And on the right, you get homogeneity by exclusion. But the problem is the demand for homogeneity to begin with. And then, of course, it's a tremendous mistake to make your group identity the paramount element of your personal being.
And I also think, though, it's also difficult, must be, to explain that there is, as a human being, inevitable cognitive dissonance. I mean, you are always weighing opposing values in your mind. I mean, take diversity and equality. Okay, so you want equality. You want everybody to be the same, but you also value diversity, which means you like everybody to be different.
Yes, well, good luck with those two.
Right.
Those two without having them rub against each other in the wrong way.
Sure, and we all believe that, all men are created equal. Yuval Harari in Sapiens does a great job of kind of explaining how this sort of very Christian idea of all men are created equal under one creator, sort of the idea that we're all of the same moral worth, we have one father. That idea is something that all of us, certainly our justice system is predicated on that notion. And so it is if you want to call it a collective myth that we've all agreed on, it does have its roots in Christianity, and it is something that we all sort of agree that it's a good starting point. But then, of course, as human beings, we don't want to be equal. We all are striving to be better than the next guy. We're trying to have more than our neighbors. We're trying to have, whatever it might be. So I think it's an interesting...
Well, we're even trying to be better than ourselves. Like, see, the thing is, look, here's the fundamental opposition, as far as I can tell. So let's go with the proposition that all men are created equal before God. So the idea there is that people partake in the logos. It's something like that, in the image of God. And it's necessary to do that, to give that respect, because that's the communicative force that structures the world. And we all partake in that by thinking and by being conscious and by communicating. We're all world engendering creatures. And so we have an intrinsic divine value because of that. That's a brilliant idea. It puts the individual paramount. But then what has to be added to that is, well, despite the fact of that bedrock value, there are qualitative differences that emerge as a consequence of our actions. You also see this in the biblical writings. It's not like everyone gets rewarded alike. But absolutely, the biblical narrative runs absolutely contrary to that. And despite the fact that it's predicated on this initial assumption of intrinsic divine value before God and the law, let's say. Well, the reason for that is that if there's no difference in value between one thing and another, then there's no reason to do anything. So if you push equality to its limit, and you forbid qualitative distinctions between concepts or people, then you undermine people's striving and deprive them of a reason for living. And the problem with that is that if you don't have a reason for living, then all you do is suffer.
Or you buy, or consumerism seems to be the new religion that is creating a lot of spiritual ennui.
Well, at least there is some distinction of value there. It's
right.
You might take exception to it and say, well, it's somewhat shallow. It is shallow, and in the final analysis, it's thin gruel, I would say. But it's at least, I would say, shallow materialism is radically preferable to nihilism. At least people get some fleeting pleasure out of their consumerism. I mean, and it is something that's aimed towards the gratification of the common man's desires, which makes it kind of nicely egalitarian. I don't think it's the highest of moral strivings, but it beats nihilism.
Anything beats nihilism. I agree with you on that. But I want to get to the self-authoring course though, because it's one thing, and I've done the self-authoring course and I loved it, and so have a lot of the people in this mixed metal arts community. We're having a great time with it. But as a guy as a 50-year-old man who's been writing and an actor and a stand-up comic, I've done what was fun for me is I've done a lot of that stuff already. I didn't do it in the kind of detail that you kind of ask for. But how do we avoid, one of the things that I find when I talk to young people about what they want to do, I feel like I'm living my goals, right? And what drives me always has been just how original can I be at the end of the day? I'm about to shoot my third special. Well, I'm only interested in being as original as I can and hopefully saying something, lending myself to the debate. I don't think that's my ultimate job, but at least I'm a comic and I don't have to be completely silly. But when I talk to young people, what I find is that they don't know. So then I'll say something like that I stole probably from someone like you, as I say, well, you need to broaden your horizons, or you need to broaden your understanding. But I hear a lot of times, if you really get down to it, well, what do you want? Well, fame, or I want to do something different or unique. But it's all these general concepts. So how do you avoid that when you're self-authoring? How do we? It's almost like I feel like giving them a reading list. I feel like saying, well, let's start with Joseph Campbell. Let's actually start with the Bible and Aristotle and Joseph Campbell, and then let's get to, and let's study, give you a course on Nietzsche. And
Well, I think you put your finger on two things. Like one is, and this is associated with this idea of qualitative distinction, is that you need to strive for something worthwhile in your life. And then the next issue is you need to have the wisdom to determine what constitutes worthwhile. And in the absence of that, you're going to go with low resolution. You're going to be like a crow attracted by shiny objects, you know, fame, money, wealth. It's like, well, those are byproducts. If things are working out ethically, those are byproducts of a much more fundamental pursuit, which is the pursuit of something that's truly worthwhile. Because otherwise, like the pursuit of fame or the pursuit of power or the pursuit of wealth, as such, will definitely corrupt you because you will make the wrong choices along the way.
Well, this has happened, you know, and you haven't been corrupted, but this has happened to you. I've watched in the past year, Jordan, you know, you have become a bit of a rock star, which to me is, I couldn't be more delighted because I think what you have to say is so important. I mean, to blow my mind after doing 200 podcasts with a lot of very smart people, I've read as much as I can. And for me to hear you break down prototypes and how important story is and why the Bible has something to offer after 2,000 years because it hits all those prototypes, comparing it to Harry Potter. And you want to talk about a mind blower, and I know I wasn't the only one, my God. Then I will listen to you on Sam Harris. You guys got caught up in the epistemology of knowledge, which was, but then the second one made sense. But I actually liked the first one as well. But, you know, it must be rather, I think you've come to it later in your life, so it's easier for you to navigate, right? I mean, but
well, there's definitely truth in that. I mean, I'm old enough now so that, well, first of all, I already had pretty much everything I wanted in any real sense. You know, I mean, I had a very worthwhile career and interesting things to do, and I have a rock solid family, and, you know, and I've been mostly healthy with some exceptions. You know, and there's been a certain amount of tragedy in my life like there is in everybody's, but there isn't, in some sense, there really isn't anything that, because I'm older and because I'm already fairly well situated in life, the consequences of what's happened to me in the last year have had fewer potential negative temptations, let's say, than they might have had I been 20.
Sure. And yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm already old enough to know that I'm old enough to understand the downside of a radical upside.
I love that. I love the way you put that.
You know, I was already grateful for what I have too. So the fact that perversely I've been offered more, although it's more like I've been stretched in both directions, because this year has been presented me with overwhelming opportunities. I just can't believe it. Like it's just breathtakingly shocking on a day-to-day basis. But I mean, it's also pulled me in the opposite extreme. You know, like I was concerned about my job. I was unbelievably ill this year for about 6 months of the last 12 months, just devastatingly ill.
Just from the stress and all that?
An independent thing. It just, two things just seem to happen at once. It's a long and complicated story, and I think I've got it mostly under control now, but it was like everything happened at once in some sense. But okay, well, back to the fame thing and so on. I mean, you don't want unearned fame because, and then the question is, well, what?
It becomes masturbatory, I think, almost. It's like,
I think it also becomes deeply shame-inspiring. Because if you don't feel that you deserve it, then the more famous you get, the bigger a fraud you are.
That's right.
And then everyone else is an idiot too, because they've fallen for the fraud. And so that makes you cynical. And Jesus, I don't care how famous and rich you are, if you feel like you're a fraud and you're cynical, you didn't win that game. I mean, that's a terrible outcome.
Yeah. Let's go back for a second to doing something meaningful with your life. Do you think it's safe to say that is almost always when you are in one way or another in a position of service, where you are giving something back? Is that a good way of looking at things, do you think, or am I being? I mean, because I'm a capitalist and I'm a free market guy. I mean, I like the idea of, you know, whatever motivates you, right? Whatever your pursuit of happiness is. I think the founding fathers left it very, very general for a reason, so that we are able to sort of, you know, it's whatever. If eating celery is fulfilling to you, then go ahead, you know, whatever it might be. And
Yeah,
I
well,
thought that was,
I think there's some utility to that. I think the idea, and I think it's well enshrined in the American ethos, that you have a right to pursue the happiness that you regard as necessary. I wouldn't say that the founders of the United States necessarily thought that pursuing happiness was the ultimate goal of life, but they certainly believed that that was a right or a privilege that could be properly accorded the common man. Right, which I really think is a brilliant. It's brilliant and ultimately tolerant in the proper sense. But the problem. So let's say you have to do something meaningful. It's not the pursuit of happiness because that's not good enough. But I also don't think it's service. And the reason for that is because I think that service is a portion of what it is. Mm-hmm. So because I think if you conduct yourself optimally, so let's say you construct your ethos properly. Here's what you're aiming for. You're aiming to fulfill yourself in a manner that allows you to continue to expand in your psychological strength. So you have to be doing something that's good now, but that also makes you stronger in the future. Mm-hmm. Okay, and at the same time, you have to be doing something that's good for other people around you now and good for them in the future. Mm-hmm. And so that way, so it's not just service to others, because that doesn't take you into account.
Right.
Right, and it's obviously not the selfish pursuit of pleasure, because, well, partly because that just doesn't work very well. These are impractical solutions. But if you said, like, look, if you have a son, say I have a son, and like I tried to treat him in a very particular way. I tried to treat him so that I relied on his capacity as an awake and aware individual. I listened to what he had to say, and I tried to treat him as if he was a qualified decision maker right from the time he was a little kid, given the limits that a little kid has. Sure. But the idea was to serve myself by having a good relationship with my son and an enjoyable relationship, but also to serve both of our future selves at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I think that here's the thing that's really cool, as far as I'm concerned, is that I believe that the sense of meaning is a seventh sense, let's call it, or a sixth sense. Genuinely speaking, I really mean that. And what the sense of meaning does is tell you when you're serving the optimal number of masters simultaneously. And you get a signal from your nervous system, and I think there are neuropsychological reasons for this that are actually quite well understood, by the way, so I think this is a scientifically grounded statement. You get a signal from your nervous system saying, all concerns, past, present, and future, are being optimally met now. And the way that manifests itself is in a sense of deep engagement with life. Right. And that's not happiness. It's better than happiness. Isn't it? Happiness springs.
It might be what Schiller called play. Man is never more authentically himself than when at play. Play being that which you would do for the sake of its own doing. So you're not doing it for money or anything else. You're doing it because it is, and play, of course, can be. I think of when I write stand-up, like when I'm working on this new special, I can spend all day sometimes. I get lost in sort of carving out the minutia, the details, the structure of the joke, the words, the melody, the tempo. It's exactly like composing a song as far as I'm concerned. And that challenge never goes away. And then, of course, when you see it, it's almost like it's going to work. And by the way, you can get even inoculated to the laughter. Laughter is what you expect. It's a magic trick. It's almost not what you're doing it for. The great pleasure comes from when you write it. And it's such a personal sort of discovery, I suppose. It's a little bit like, I've always loved those ideas of like that. I think it was the mathematician who refused the Fields Medal in mathematics and comes with $1 million prize. And they said, well, why did you do that? And he said, well, you're rewarding the radio, so to speak. I have a certain kind of wiring that was able to channel that particular equation. The template in the sky came through me just because of the way I'm wired. So give it to the equation, not to me. I'm sort of a midwife to the process, which is kind of a beautiful way to look at things. I don't know where I'm going with that, but
like the play idea works on a number of levels. So the first is that you see children engaged in play. And as they're engaged in play, they're practicing who they could be. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the meaning in that is that they're building their future selves. And so that's spontaneously engaging. They're on the right developmental path. And then there's other aspects of play. So there's the play that occurs when you're playing a piece of music, for example. And that's also a place where everything is lining up harmoniously, because that's what music models. And when you're deeply engaged in that. So that's another form of play. And if it's going well, there's a spontaneity about it as well as a discipline. And then when you're playing around with ideas, the same thing happens. And then there's another level at which play works too, because our lives are a play, as Shakespeare pointed out. And if that wasn't the case, we wouldn't use movies and literature to model them. And so the trick is to get the play right. And that's partly what the hero mythology is about, right? The hero mythology is about getting the play right. And if you're the right actor in your play, then you're the force that speaks the world into proper being, and also the force that revitalizes the state when it becomes too corrupt. And if you're doing that, then, well, the thing that I think is so massively amazing about this set of ideas, this archetypal set of ideas, is, so there's this idea, of course, that life is characterized by tragedy, vulnerability, and malevolence, right? We all have to cope with all of those things. And they're absolute and non-trivial. But what's so interesting about that is there actually is an antidote to that. And the antidote is something like the pursuit of meaning. Because if the meaning in your life is deep enough, this is obviously something that Nietzsche knew very well. You know, he said, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. If your sense of meaning is deep enough, then you can withstand the tragedy and what would you call, and keep the malevolence at bay. Mm-hmm. And then you get to have your cake and eat it too. You get to have all the wonderful things about limited being, but you get to transcend it simultaneously.
I think about Nietzsche a lot too, because he was sick his whole life. I mean, he was a sickly man, and yet he had this notion of plural truths, which is something that probably you have trouble reconciling with, because I think of you as somebody who believes in to an extent a fixed truth, in the notion of sort of like one God, and the sort of the fixed morality. But he was a big believer in sort of taking the 7 deadly sins and turning them on their head. Pride is another way of looking at pride, is self-esteem as an example, right? So there were different. I've always found sort of his living example and what he was able to etch from that, despite his deep physical discomfort, to be kind of fascinating, kind of amazing that he talked about the circus of life.
A variety of things there. I mean, yes, he was a very ill man and died very young and very horribly, I would say, but he was courageous enough to continually celebrate being despite that. And I would say, with regards to the truth idea, I found it really useful to segregate truth in some sense, to recategorize it as truth and meta-truth. And this is something that many people have formulated in different ways. Jean Piaget, for example, and also Nietzsche to some degree. The meta-truth is the process by which proximate truths are generated. Okay. So it's like the difference between a factory and a car. Mm-hmm. And the meta-truth is that you should align yourself with the truth that generates truth. And that's why I'm such an advocate of free speech, because speech, the logos, is the thing that generates all proximal truths. And, like a boxed truth is like a tool you use to attain a certain set of goals or to structure your world in over a certain period of time. And those are somewhat mutable. But there's an underlying truth underneath that, which is that as the generator of tools, as the engine that generates tools, or as the engine that generates truth, you deserve the highest order of respect. And I would call that an ultimate truth.
I also think that meta-truth can also be looked at. Like, I think Plato's forms touched on it in the sense that you may not be able to, you'll never see a perfect man, a perfect horse, or even a perfect triangle, but you can certainly imagine it. And if you can imagine it, you can reach for it. I mean, that would probably be what your Christ figures are for, right? I mean, that's you'll never be able to embody his living example 100%, but at least you can try. You can reach.
It's also kind of a relief that you can't. Mm-hmm. I mean, because what you want from a goal, and this is where the Sisyphus idea sort of comes in, what you want from a goal is that it reseeds and transforms into something better as you approach it. Because you might think, well, I want to achieve it. It's like, wait a second here. The problem with being able to achieve it is that you eliminate from your life then the benefits of meaningful striving.
Yeah.
And so if you have a goal that you can achieve, the problem with that goal is that you can achieve it. What you want instead is a goal that moves ahead as you walk towards it, and every time it moves ahead, it turns into something better and better and better.
Yeah.
And then you get to move ahead and benefit from it, but you never run out of things to do. And that's why an archetypal figure like Christ, who's simultaneously man and divinity itself, is the perfect goal, because, well, it's going to recede as you approach it. And that's good, because you're not going to run out of things to do.
It also might be the difference between an artist and a celebrity. I mean, if celebrity and fame is what you're reaching for, then, but if you want to be an artist, which really means you're in the business of original self-expression, as far as I'm concerned, that's never going to be something you're going to be satisfied with. But thank God, you'll always have that. Martha Graham called it a queer dissatisfaction. But by the way, and not even your business to judge it. Just put it out there because you can, and do it to the best of your ability. But there is a certain catastrophe to success. Tennessee Williams wrote a great essay about this, where he, when he became a famous playwright, I know this almost firsthand. I mean, I have a little bit of, like, not to be, but I'm on TV, and I got this other podcast, but I'm stand-up, so I have a little bit of, I've felt a little bit of this fame, and sometimes it gets higher and other times it gets lower, but seems lately, I've been doing this a long enough time so that I get recognized, as an example. But I've also been very close to big fame. I'm very close to Joe Rogan as one of my closest friends, or guys like Bradley Cooper. I know a lot of people that are pretty darn famous, and I've seen what that looks like up close, and boy, does that get, I mean, look, we're all blessed. Anybody's blessed to be making money and people love you, but you can get very, not only used to that, but rather tired of that if that's the end goal. There's that saying in Hollywood, people spend their time climbing the wall and they realize it's either the wrong wall or they don't like the view. And that's for sure, man. That's
the danger of totalitarian certainty, is that you'll end up in a place that you thought was perfect that you don't want to be. But I think your artist-celebrity distinction is a really good one, because if you're a real artist, it's acceptable and appropriate that you be a celebrity. Mm-hmm. But it's not acceptable that you be a celebrity without being an artist. And the reason for that is, well, there's a falsity about it, but even worse than that is you're going to pay for it, man.
Oh, yeah.
That's not something you'd wish on your worst enemy, to be a false celebrity. That's not an entertaining position to be in.
Not at all.
So, no. And the artist celebrity is a nice distinction in relationship to the idea of an ever receding ideal, because an artist, there's an interesting thing that goes along. So let's say an artist has a problem to be solved that can never be solved completely. Mm. And it's also, here's a leap for you, like a lateral leap that's quite a fun one, because so let's say one of the most fundamental metaphysical questions with regards to Genesis and the idea of the initial paradise is, why the hell would God put a snake in the garden? And I think one answer, because he's God, he didn't have to put a damn snake in the garden, so why bother? And one answer might be, well, you can't make a garden without a snake, because you can't make a bounded space without the risk of things outside that bounded space creeping in. Okay, and I think there's really something to that. But the second thing is that, well, what makes you so sure that you want a garden without snakes? Like, that's the totalitarian ideal, right? A paradise.
Utopia. Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, maybe you want a garden full of snakes that you're capable of fighting.
Well, I mean, the totalitarian states of, I mean, if you go Mao's China and Pol Pot's Cambodia, and certainly Lenin's Russia, the idea was that we are going to create a utopia, that we are going to create the Garden of Eden with no snakes, because everybody's going to be equal, and we saw how that turned out.
Yeah, it turned out that the snakes multiplied like mad, and everybody, see, because here's another way of thinking about it. Let's say you want to set up the ideal garden for your children, speaking metaphorically. Well, you take everything dangerous out of it. Well, then you could say, well, then they're safe. But the problem with that is that they're safe, but they're weak and bored.
Yeah.
So maybe what you do is you put enough danger in there so that contending with it makes them stronger and more thoroughly developed and expanded across time. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's the sort of, maybe you don't want a life without problems, You want a life that's full of the kind of problems that solving makes you better and better, and
That's
everything
right.
around you better and better. And it's conceivable. Like, I actually think it's conceivable that that's the way being itself is actually structured, if we could only see it that way, is that the challenges that are before us are of a kind that we can continually master, and that everything can be better as a consequence of that. And that's actually better than not having any problems at all.
Of course, I mean, Tennessee Williams in his essay, The Catastrophe of Success, said the wolf at the door is luxury. That's the wolf at the door. You know, it wasn't until he when he got famous, he started not being able to sort of distinguish between the gravy and the chocolate syrup that was in his, you know, he'd get this expensive room service and an ancient woman would lug it in, and he was embarrassed because she was waiting on him and she could barely walk, and he was in this first class suite in Manhattan, and people would say great job, and just the sound, it sounded like syrup. It was like somebody was pouring syrup down his throat. And he said I realized that my life was a life built for endurance. I'm a writer. And writing is hard work, man, because you're coming up with something out of nothing. And his whole life, he'd been a gay man in the South, and he was a closeted man who, you know, the whole thing sucked. But God, did he write great plays? And it wasn't until he needed an eye operation, and he by the way, after The Glass Menagerie, he couldn't write anymore. So he needed an eye operation, and he hints that it was almost voluntary. And he was behind this gauze pad, very uncomfortable. And he went and rented a rudimentary shack in Mexico where he had to do everything for himself. And that's when he wrote A Streetcar Named Desire.
Yeah.
I never forgot that kind of stuff. So,
well, you know, I had this vision at one point. It was a very elaborate vision, but part of it involved, I was thrown into did you see the new new movie, the new Thor movie?
I didn't, but I heard it was great. Ragnarok.
It's pretty tongue-in-cheek. It's pretty funny. Anyways, there's this scene where an essentially godlike figure who runs a planet throws Thor into like a Roman Colosseum ring to fight the Hulk. So anyways, so this is what my vision was like. I had this about 2 years ago, but I was thrown into this Roman Colosseum ring with Satan himself by God. And I had to undergo this terrible fight, and I won. And afterwards, I said, "Well, you know, what the hell? Like, what are you doing here? Why would you do that? Why would you put me up against an opponent of that appalling quality? Why would you do that?" And the answer was, because I knew you could win.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I don't know really what to make of that. I don't know what to make of the vision or the moral of the story, let's say. But I mean, there is something to be said for the respect that you offer to someone when presenting them with an adversary that would test their mettle, let's say.
Of course. Of
So,
course.
and you know, if you're going to set up a match, like a mixed martial arts match, you want to set someone up with an opponent who has a pretty damn good chance of defeating them.
Well, they have a saying. They have a saying in mixed martial arts gyms, which is metal sharpens metal. You know, iron sharpens iron. You need training partners that push you. You need training partners that are as good as you or better, and that's how you get better. I mean, it's how everything is. You know.
Yeah, well, that's a hell of a statement. You know, when you think that's how everything is, because it means that you need. You know, it seems to me. And again, I'm going to speak metaphysically momentarily, is to me, being is striving upwards towards the manifestation of more and more complexity and more beauty and more good. And it's an all-in game, and it's a dangerous game. It can go terribly wrong, as we've seen happen so many times. But the game, I think, eternally transforms itself into something more and more worthwhile, or at least could. But a precondition for that is that there has to be limitation and there has to be an adversary, because otherwise there's no impetus for that transformation.
I want to get your perspective on this, because as you were talking about that, I thought to myself that is such a beautiful way of, I mean, when you talk about the self-authoring program and you talk about getting yourself in order, as you call it, which I loved. I think you ended Rogan's podcast, one of them, that way. Put yourself in order, clean your own room. I really do worry with social media and the fact that whatever you do can be not only captured on someone's camera, but put out there forever. So if you make one mistake, you are discredited. And we seem to love taking a person who might have, let's say, a proclivity for sex or whatever it might be, and we'll take that label and inflate it and staple it to their face. And that's it. You have been dismissed from the conversation, sir. And I was thinking about Picasso and Hemingway and even Gandhi and certainly Martin Luther King and Albert Einstein, all of whom I believe practiced some gross infidelity. They all cheated on their wives, from what I understand. They were certainly ladies' men. And I don't think that's what we want to focus on when it comes to those 4 or 5 men. I mean, I can line them up. If you want to throw the first stone, go ahead. But I don't feel like doing that because I think they had a lot to offer. Now, it didn't mean that their personalities didn't have some deficits because, again, we're human beings. But I really worry that in today's world where you can record and stamp that somewhere where it's indelible, where I can just get to it by just Googling someone's name, what is that going to do to the great risk takers? What's that going to do? Because, there are people, your heroes may be ambitious for creating a great cure for something or developing some new technology. But ambition cuts all the way across. They may also have an insatiable demand for women, drugs, booze, and they may make an asshole out of themselves.
It may also be offered to them in spades.
It is. I've seen it. I have seen that with my own life. It's offered. Nobody realizes, unless you've been like in Hollywood the way I have, around pro athletes and movie stars. No one realizes the degree. We are monkeys, man. At the end of the day, we're apes, and the alpha male and the alpha female get anything they want, but especially the alpha male, the way our society is structured. Let me tell you, I've been in Vegas with very famous athletes, and I am not kidding when I say this. Women were paraded by another woman in front of these 2 men I happen to have been with. And I thought to myself, wow. I mean, wow. It was so... we may as well have been cavemen. I mean, it was incredible. It was incredible. It was like baboons or something,
Yeah, well, the thing is, there's no nobility in fidelity if you don't have a temptation. And many people who agitate madly for fidelity and throw the first stone at those who have cheated are those who have been unfortunate enough, let's say, to never have developed the character or status that would put temptation in front of them. And so then they trumpet that as a virtue. It's like, well, I've never slept with anyone but my wife. It's like, yeah, well, buddy, no one wants to sleep with you. That's not a virtue. It's just another indication of how pathetic you are. Because you can easily say that, well, let's say, compared to someone who's just pathetic, a pro athlete who has his pick of women is much better in every way. But then you might say that the pro athlete who decides to live morally despite that temptation has even entered a new category of better.
I would agree with you. I would agree with you. He's got to say no 15 times a day. But why do you think it is that? Because I was thinking about this sexual harassment sort of revolution, which I think has a lot of positive aspects to it, as well as some negatives, But I like the idea that women, for the first time, have recourse. I like that there's a female whisper network. There's always been a male whisper network. I mean, certainly in Hollywood, if you are a woman, and I know plenty, if you complain about a star grabbing your crotch, and this is a real instance, they would say, look, yes, we understand, but just know that if you complain about this person, you will be finished in this business. And so women have had to bear the brunt of a lot of that bullshit for a long time. And so I don't mind. Well, why is it that we are so unforgiving of any kind of sexual misconduct, whereas you could have a gambling problem that puts your kids on the street, a heroin problem that where you forgot to feed your dog and put your kids on the street, or leaves their kids without a father. And we have a great deal of empathy for people who seem to have that personality deficit, but not the other. Not when a man's a lech.
That's a great question. I mean, it's because sex is always the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and also because we're so clueless when it comes to sex that it's beyond description. And so
in this country or in general?
In general,
America?
I'm going to address that in two ways. The first thing I would say is that one thing we have to be very careful about noting is that, so there's this principle called the Pareto distribution. And the Pareto distribution is a statement of economic science. And it basically says that the square root of the number of people in a domain produce half the output. And so let's say if there's recording artists, if there's 1,000 recording artists, 30 of them will produce half the records. And then of that half the records, let's say that's 100 records, just for the sake of argument. So 30 of them produce 100 records. 10 of them will sell half the copies. Okay, so that's the square root law, and it's a killer law. So it means if there's 10,000 recording artists, 100 of them will sell half the records.
And if I could, for some of the listeners, because that sounds a little complicated, but I think Pareto also came up with this principle when he was gardening with peas. And I think that the peas, he found that like 20% of the shoots produced 80% of his peas. And then he started looking at sort of the businesses, and he found that 20% of his employees are producing 80% of the results. 20% of the employees might be producing 80% of the problems. So there's a way to
Let's focus on that one.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at criminal behavior. Okay, so first of all, it's about 5% of men, mostly, who are criminals. But 95% of the criminal activity is created by a very small proportion of that criminal population. So hardly anyone is criminal, first. Of the criminals, hardly anyone is a serial criminal. But the serial criminals commit all the crimes. Okay, so now let's put that in terms of men. Hardly any men are sexual predators. Of the small percentage of men who are sexual predators, there is a specialty group who commits all the sexual serial crimes, and they can involve themselves with hundreds of women or thousands of women. So the environment for catastrophe that they produce is massive. But that does not mean that it's characteristic of all men. And that's something that's getting seriously lost in the shuffle.
Well, Jonathan Haidt, to piggyback on that, gives sort of when he's talking about how these universities have these students that are so entitled to their own sovereignty, their own point of view, and their own sort of and how their inner sensibilities can never be trampled on and are so quick to. They have such irreverence for authority and people who've been there longer, comes from the 80s when a lot of these children came up missing. And when you say a lot in the grand scheme of things, very few, but it was enough. Anytime a child goes missing and is abducted and killed and ends up on a milk carton, it's just horrifying. If you have children, it's your worst nightmare. And there's nothing that scares me more. But that created, I mean, I don't know if it's his hypothesis, but it's one of the main factors that contributed to helicopter parenting. So a small number of a very small group of people, who knows how many, probably 100, changed the culture, changed how Americans parent their children. It takes very few people to usher in a massive behavioral cultural shift.
Well, okay,
right?
so what we've come to half the answer, which is, well, women are rightly upset about the small minority of serial male sexual predators. Okay, fine. But that doesn't mean that all men are guilty. It does not mean that at all. And it shouldn't be. And the danger is that we're entering into a realm where unfounded accusations against men can have devastating consequences, and that's not good for anyone, especially because there are no shortage of people willing to use bureaucratic interventions, against people who aren't guilty, or to sully their reputations for purposes of revenge and spite. So, but then you asked another question, which is, well, why is the sexual issue so paramount? And the answer to that is because the birth control pill threw such a monkey wrench into our sexual preconceptions that it'll take us 1,000 years to recover. Because hypothetically, what the pill does is make non-consequential sex possible. But as far as I'm concerned, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that there's ever such a thing as non-consequential sex. Because for sex to be non-consequential, you have to say, well, A, it's merely a matter of physical pleasure. B, that it can be dispensed with after the act, the two people involved can be dispensed with, so to speak, and move on with their life as if nothing ever happened, and that there are no emotional, physical, or procreational consequences. And all of that's not true. It's not true. And so, on the one hand, and I think this is particularly true of the left, there's been a staggering push for sexual liberation since the early 1960s, since the birth control pill, so that anything goes at any time. And on the other hand, there's this realization that, hey, wait a minute, we're playing with fire here.
Yeah.
And everything can't just go all the time. It turns out that people's emotions get tangled up, and that the consent lines aren't obvious, and that what constitutes sexual assault isn't clear, and
Yep.
even what constitutes consent isn't obvious. And so we're trying to have our cake and eat it, and that's just not working out very well.
And I think for a long time, men have not had to even think about their sexual impact. I mean, their sexual behavior, really. I mean, you know, it was always, it is a culture, and maybe the 60s and the 70s are the ones that sort of, that movement ushered in the idea that, you know, sex it's free sex. You hear it all the time. It's free sex. Sex is free in that sense.
Can you, to me, when I hear that, I mean, I can't possibly imagine a more preposterous statement. I think, have you not lived? You think sex is free? It's like, what planet are you from?
Yeah.
It's never free. And so then the question is how we should treat it. And, you know, I think, and I actually think the data on this is pretty clear. It's pretty clear that people who have monogamous relationships, you know, high quality monogamous relationships, are most sexually satisfied. That's quite evident.
I don't know. I do think that people are always looking for that. I do think people have, for the most part, most people have a nostalgia to find their soulmate, quote unquote, or someone who they can be monogamous with. And I think men arrive at that desire later in life, probably by and large. I don't know, but yes, but I think that a lot of times people are sort of playing the field and having a lot of sexual partners in pursuit of that goal. So there are a lot of reasons. Sex is so complicated. I mean, you know, a lot of times men and women will have sex with a lot of partners because it makes them feel desired. It gives them a sense of power. It gives them a sense of like, I don't know, almost accomplishment.
It's also a direct indicator of status. I mean, let's make no mistake about this. We're certainly not saying that the person who has no opportunity for sexual conduct is ethical. It's like, it's not that at all. But the problem is that, see, I don't think that physical intimacy should ever be divorced from psychological intimacy. I think it's a huge error. I think it lays you waste. Because let's say you're one of these alpha guys that has women paraded in front of them. I mean, the probability that you're going to generate a sense of the same sorts of contempt for women that you would generate, that Tennessee Williams talked about when he couldn't distinguish the syrup from the gravy because there was just too much of it. Like any entity that any currency that's devalued becomes contemptible.
Well, I've heard this from, you know, I know some men who are in that position where women just, it's astonishing. I've seen it with my own eyes. You just go, and I always hear them say, I to a man, they always say something like, at the end of the day, it's all the same shit, bro. You know, you know.
And the thing is, you know, in some sense, apart from the novelty element, which is an important thing to consider, all casual sex acts are the same. Because, you know, you might say, well, isn't it boring and routine to always sleep with the same woman? And I would say, well, yes, it is. But then the question is, when is it that you're actually sleeping with the same woman? And the answer to that's simple. When you're sleeping with sequential sluts, you're sleeping with the same woman. Because there's nothing there but the bare mechanics of the act.
Yeah.
And so that's what's repetitive. Whereas if you're in a relationship with someone that's deep and profound and meaningful, and I'm not being naively optimistic about this,
Yeah.
then it's not the same thing all the time. Or if it is, it's a consequence of the limitations of your ability and your imagination.
Yeah, and you call them sluts. I just call them women that have been usually manipulated by a charming guy who's promising them things.
Well, I'm
doesn't
obviously
plan on delivering.
speaking
No.
for dramatic effect.
I know. I think though also there's a phenomenon where the men that are like that, who have all this access and just, you know, it becomes this sort of candy shop, a kid in a candy shop, they have to keep upping the ante.
Yeah.
You know, they say this about serial killers. I've read
yeah,
some
you
profiles
bet,
where, you know, you start by, you know, sneaking into a store and cutting leather jackets with a razor blade because you like the way it feels, and you could get caught, and it's kind of thing. And then once you just keep upping the ante until you're doing it to a real human being, for God's sake, in some dungeon.
That's that novelty edge. That's exactly right. And that is what happens with serial killers. They often start by torturing animals.
Yeah. And they just have to keep getting until they, you know, I mean, there's no end to it.
Yeah.
You've studied that, haven't you? You've studied that phenomenon, I think.
Oh yeah. I've read as deeply as I can into like the most horrifying of possible pathologies. You know, I've looked deeply into the serial killer types and the mass murderers and the genocide artists and the Auschwitz prison guards, and the most brutal events I ever read about took place in a scientific research unit, called Unit 731. It was a Japanese unit that operated in China, and what happened there is so brutal that, well, we'll put it this: it's the most brutal thing I've ever seen anywhere by like an order of magnitude. It's just absolutely it's absolutely jaw-droppingly horrifying. I wouldn't recommend even looking it up, because just reading about it is enough to give you trauma.
I read some of it. I've actually read, because I went down that damn rabbit hole of what the Japanese did to Manchuria, and then you know, and I actually, my area of focus was Nazi Germany. I was a history major, and of course I read the Gulag Archipelago, and I had, you know, studied my Nietzsche. So that's why you resonated so deeply with me. As I said, oh my God, somebody sort of my generation is talking about these. It's funny how we forget what collective madness looks like. And we have the 20th century, there are plenty of examples, and we probably have 50 million graves to thank for that collective madness.
Oh, yes.
When the wrong idea...
Well, when the wrong idea takes hold, and this isn't my idea, but Yuval Harari was making this sort of parallel. When a biological pathogen invades its host, a human being, it doesn't have any concern for its host. What it wants to do is live off its host and then procreate, move on to another host when that host is no longer there. So if it kills that host, so be it. And then it moves, and that's how plagues will spread. So plagues, you know, like take the HIV virus, AIDS in the 80s and the 90s, which I remember very well. You know, it wasn't concerned with what it was leaving behind. It was only concerned in spreading. And bad ideas can do the same thing. I mean, bad ideas there can be this sort of sense of collective madness, and they can, like a meme, they can go from one brain to the other until the entire population is insane.
Don't you think, do you think
it's happened plenty of times. I mean, and on both sides of the political spectrum. It's yes, and you'd think that, well, if we had any sense, the 20th century would have taught us that that's a very bad idea, unless that's the outcome that you're looking for.
Right. But that's why it's so important to listen to the other side. We call it idea sex. That's why civility is very important. Civility is crucial, because your side may not be entirely rooted in the truth, entirely rooted in love, and their side may not be entirely rooted in evil and falsehood. So sometimes just having the civility to listen to each other and at least figure out what you do agree on, you know, that's what I think is fascinating.
Well, I have, in this new book I wrote called 12 Rules for Life, which is coming out January 23rd, I have a chapter in there on listening. It says, the title of the chapter, it's one of the rules, is listen to the other person as if they might know something you don't. And the reason that you would do that is because, well, you are full of error, and your errors are going to manifest themselves in unnecessary suffering and malevolence within your life. That's what's going to happen. And if you talk to someone else and you listen to them, they will tell you things you don't know. And even if they tell you a bunch of things you don't agree with, the probability that if you listen to someone, they will tell you something you don't know is really high. And then that means that's one less tragic and horrible thing you have to deal with in your life.
Well, isn't an ideology, isn't when you commit to an ideology, you are essentially saying that your side has the fixed truth. It has the truth.
Sure, that's exactly what socialism
and anything else is heresy. And so, and in fact, you may be so corrupted as an adult that we may have to kill you because you're not re-educationable anyway.
Yeah.
So if you're wearing
glasses and you're in Pol Pot's Cambodia, maybe it's best if you're an intellectual. We'll just kill all the college professors anyway because they're too far gone.
You know, one of the most horrible things about that, by the way, was the architect of that entire plan had a PhD from the Sorbonne. And he laid out his plan for Cambodia in a PhD thesis that the French intellectuals granted him his doctorate for.
Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, sure.
Yeah, man. That's why whenever I have the privilege of talking to a lot of academics, but people can get super cloistered and super sort of theoretical with their recommendations and their books. And I always try, at least lately, to kind of like hold their feet to the fire. And I was like, what does this look like? Well, I want to extrapolate your theory and I want to see what it actually looks like in practice. What are you actually asking for?
And tends to look a lot like Venezuela in practice.
You're goddamn right it does.
In the last week, in the New York Times, has released stories showing that the way the Venezuelan authorities are dealing with the problem of childhood starvation is by making it illegal for hospitals to use malnutrition as a cause of death.
Wow.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, that's hell on earth, by the way, watching your kids starve to death. That's hell on earth. And you always say you can imagine it. Address this, and I want to get into the self-authoring program because a lot of people want to. But before you do that, just address this. There was a woman who wrote an article about how words can be violent and speech can be physically violent because it causes stress in the listener, and as a result, stress can be a physiological change. I vehemently disagree with these people, but I want to.
I'm going to reverse that. I'm going to say, well, they're absolutely right, but there's a big but here, and this is a technical problem, methodological problem with the research. So let's say that I think you're wrong about something. Maybe you're a family member of mine, eh? And I think you're wrong about this. And when I mean wrong, I think if you keep doing this, bad things are going to happen to you or the people that you love. That's what wrong means. Yeah. Okay, so we have a stressful conversation about this, and it's bloody stressful. Like, you know, your heart rate goes up, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, you're sweating. It's like, it's really
you're not comfortable.
You're not comfortable. No, you're prepared for a fight. So you're in emergency preparation mode, and maybe like it's just too much. And so the idea that the interchange of opinions can be stressful, even to the point of harm, is absolutely correct. But what about the consequences of not having those conversations? So there's two consequences. Is one, well, you just let people proceed on their merry way as they're wandering into a pit and dying. And so that's also pretty stressful. And second, here, the time frame of the investigation really matters. So let me give you an example. I can use this from the self-authoring program. So if I say, okay, you sit down now and write about your past. Write about the things about your past that still bother you when you think about them. They're more than 18 months old, but when you think about them, they still bring a tear to your eye or make you angry or something like that. And say, okay, you're going to want to avoid those things because they're emotionally, they're still enmeshed in an emotional framework. But I'm going to say, no, you just plow through them, man. You plow through them. Okay, so, and then I get your subjective self-report on that. And you're going to say, Jesus, that was horrible. I was sweaty, I was afraid, I was angry. And then I'll track you for 2 weeks and your mood will have gone down. It'll be worse. And so then my conclusion would be, oh, you shouldn't be writing about terrible things that happened to you in the past because look how bad it is for you. But if I track you for 6 months, then I find out that you've got much better. So the problem with these words is violence argument is, okay, fair enough. What time frame? What's your damn time frame? And what's your comparison? So and there's plenty of research in the psychological literature on repressors. So these are people who don't engage in conflict at all, regardless of the fact that they have something to have conflict about. And what you see is that on the surface, they look reasonably well regulated emotionally. But if you take psychophysiological measurements, they're just a mess.
Right.
So of course words can cause trouble, and they can even, like, there are times when I'd rather be punched than assaulted verbally, let's say.
Right.
It's just faster to get it over with, you know?
Yeah.
But that's not the issue. The issue is we're talking about a game that propagates across time.
Yeah.
And the hypothesis of the people on the words are violence end of the spectrum is that the net consequence of not allowing people to engage in difficult conflict is going to be positive. It's like, I think that's so naive that I think it's naive to the point of criminality.
I agree.
So people have to come out and have conflict, man, and it's hard. It's rough. But I have an alternative.
I have to say that when I listen to you give that answer, it's a little bit like I like to box, and then sometimes I'll get in the ring with guys who are not very athletic or they haven't done it, and I start to think to myself, maybe I'm picking up on this. Maybe I'm a good boxer. God forbid, I'm a 50-year-old actor. And then I get in the ring with a guy who's a good amateur or a pro, and he doesn't hit me because he would knock me out, but he just peppers me a little bit, and I realize, I would. And I have to say, sir, when I speak to you, I feel the exact same way. I read all these books, and I figure I look at myself as somebody who's starting to get all these ideas, and then you come up with this great answer, and I thought, why didn't I think of that? Damn it! Well, anyway, it'll be fun to parrot you as I usually do. So thank you for that distinction. That's a really important one. And
yeah, it's useful to know where the real damage is, because it's so easy to say, oh no, you're wrong about your argument about words causing trouble. It's like, hey, let's make no mistake about it, man. A few well-aimed words can just pierce someone's heart.
Yeah.
But then the question is, well, all right, so let's just all shut up for 2 or 3 years and not say what we think. Okay, let's try that as an alternative.
Well, not only that, it's to get better at something, you have to be uncomfortable. I mean, you want to get in shape, it's going to be a bitch. If you want to be good at,
you're going to have to stumble around like an idiot and get in trouble.
Yes, if you want to be good at jiu-jitsu or boxing, you're going to get punched or submitted a lot. I mean, come on, that's how you get better. So take us. I don't want to give away too much of the self-authoring thing, because I want people to buy it, because I think it's so worthwhile, and I think you can't. It's something that you are, especially as a young person, my God, you really, like asking people to describe the 7 epochs of their life, for example. What do you want to say about the self-authoring program?
Sure. Okay, well, the first thing I'd say is, look, if your life is a play, or if your life is play, then you better bloody well pick your part, because if you don't, circumstances or other people will. And the probability that other people will pick a leading role for you is very, very low. And if you're just the victim of circumstances, then that's exactly what you're going to be. So I would say you should be very afraid of that. And so then we might say, well, let's say instead you get to write your own part. Well, how do you do that? Well, the first thing is you need to know who you are and where you are. And the way you do that is by taking stock of your current situation. That's the past authoring. It's like, okay, articulate your experience. Where have you been? What have you learned? Where are you now? And so that technically we have people divide their past experience into 7 epochs and then write about the most emotionally significant events of those epochs. And I would say people should do that badly, because you're not going to do it perfectly. You're no novelist. You're no writer. Get it down, because just getting it down and articulating it is going to put you way ahead of where you are. It's going to enable you to put down things that you should no longer be carrying. Okay, now, let's say you've done that. You specified where you are and where you're not. That's the other part of it. Well, then the next issue might be, well, who are you? And the present authoring part of the future authoring program, which is basically a 3-part series, says, okay, well, let's do a quick personality analysis and figure out what your virtues and your faults are. And the virtues are the toolkit you can use to move yourself ahead in life and to protect yourself against tragedy and malevolence. And the faults are things that you should rectify, because otherwise you're going to fall into a pit. So let's get that straight. And then the third part is the future authoring program. And so this is where you get a chance to, let's say, write your own destiny and to act as if you're someone who writes your own destiny. And so the first part of that is, okay, let's assume that you're actually taking care of yourself. you know that you're a lowly individual and full of flaws, and that you're reprehensible in many ways. But let's assume that you're going to try to ennoble and enlighten yourself as if you were actually worthwhile, right? So you got to put yourself in that mind frame. So then the next question would be, all right, so now you get to decide in 3 to 5 years, you can have what would be good for you, as if you were someone you were taking care of. What is that? Just hypothetically. So what do you want for you? And then we break it down. What do you want from your friends? Who do you want your friends to be and why? What do you want for an intimate relationship? How do you want to configure your familial relationships? What are your career goals? What are your educational goals? How are you going to use your time in a high quality manner outside of your obligations? And how are you going to handle temptations like alcohol and drugs? So just hypothetically, what would you like? Well, at least that gives you something to aim for.
When I had to do that, I have to say you have to confront a lot of your own contradictions. You have to confront a lot. It's very hard to ask yourself what you really want. It kind of forces you to face up to. It's embarrassing sometimes. You got to take responsibility for it.
Oh God! So all of those things.
Yeah.
It does reveal that you're full of inner contradictions. It's actually because you're the follower of multiple gods. Even if you don't know that, you're basically polytheistic. You're not well.
Exactly.
So
dilate on that a little bit. That's exactly right.
Well, because you're being driven, let's say, or possessed by fundamental forces that are beyond your comprehension. Like your whole mode of being, and I don't mean this personally, obviously, your whole mode of being might be because you're ruled by anger. Or maybe you're ruled by sex, or maybe you're ruled by resentment. Like those things are gods as far as you're concerned. They're way bigger than you. And so unless you organize yourself in the face of those things, or you might be a situation where sometimes you're resentful and sometimes you're angry and sometimes you're pleasure seeking and sometimes you're afraid, and so you just bounce from dismal god to dismal god essentially. Yeah.
Which might be an argument for why you have to have one overwhelming.
It is exactly the argument for that. That's precisely the argument that Carl Jung makes. It's like the transformation from polytheism to monotheism is the transformation from a chaotic mode of valuation, where you're being pulled in multiple directions by all sorts of things, into something that's integrated under one ring, let's say. You think about it from that.
Yeah. Jung got really into the Eastern religions, but Jung wasn't a Christian or a Jew, or he wasn't. Was he? How did he? He was. Okay.
He was a very strange Christian.
Yeah.
I would say that Jung was a true Christian, which makes him a very, very strange Christian indeed, because he took the idea of the imitation of Christ extremely seriously and believed that was actually the ethical duty of Christians. And that's a terrible burden. One of the things you have to do, to be an imitator of Christ archetypally, here's one thing you have to do. You said that you read the Gulag Archipelago and read about the accounts of Japan invading Manchuria. Generally when people do that first of all, generally people don't do that sort of reading. So that's the first thing. But then when they do that sort of reading, they're sort of a bystander. They think, well, look at all the horrible things those people did. It's like, that's the wrong attitude. The right attitude is, I'm just like those people who did those horrible things. Now, there's this idea that Christ took the world's sins upon himself. Yeah. And that's a redemptive move, or the ultimate redemptive move even. But the thing is that if you're an imitator of Christ, which is what you are if you're a Christian, then that's your moral obligation, is that when you read about the Nazis, you're reading an autobiography. You're not reading about the Nazis.
That's fascinating to me, and I remember you saying that and you've helped soldiers with PTSD this way, because there's a book called I think it's called Our Inner Ape, and it's about how we are essentially a bipolar ape, capable of incredible kindness and, of course, unspeakable evil. And we occupy that spectrum. And when you realize that you have the capacity, certainly as an actor, one of the things my acting teacher would always say was, we have all of that in us. I think it was Stanislavski said, if you can kill a fly, you can kill a human being. You can just extrapolate. It's like sort of you use the magic if, and you can use your imagination. And if you can't, then you're probably not an actor, or you're not being honest with yourself. So you know, that really resonates with me when you talk about that
Well,
stuff.
but one of the things that I really found unbelievably useful about Jung, Carl Jung was such a genius. It's just unbelievable. He was so damn smart. So one of the things he also said, this is sort of associated with the archetypal idea of the harrowing of hell, but he also said that you cannot be good until you recognize your capacity for malevolence. So the pathway to good is actually through the technology, let's say, of taking the world's sins on yourself. Until you realize, you've got to understand deeply that you could do what the Auschwitz guard did and enjoy it. Until you understand that, there's no way you can be good, because you cannot be afraid enough of yourself to be good.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing. So
It is.
So now you're talking about how to speak to yourself, and I think that's crucial. I don't remember you touching on that as much in the self-authoring program. Well, but you do. I mean, with the questions that you're asking. But it's one thing to do a self-authoring program, then it's another thing to keep it going. And I'm a big believer in daily inspiration. And that can sometimes, well, not sometimes, but it's very important to learn how to talk to yourself, especially if you're competitive, especially if you are constantly put to the test, whether you're in a ring as a boxer, whether you're in an audition room, whether you're in a pitch room. You've got to figure out a way to talk to yourself so that you don't choke, so that you don't get in your own way. How do you get out of your own way? Is there a primary question?
Sure. Well, in 12 Rules for Life, again, I have a chapter addressing that exactly, and it's called Compare Yourself to Who You Were Yesterday, Not to Who Someone Else Is Today.
Yeah.
And I think that, so the proper way to talk to yourself is something like, not, oh, you're wonderful and don't you deserve to have all sorts of self-esteem and all of that stuff. That's complete naive nonsense in my estimation.
Like The Secret, a silly book.
Yes, well, that's right. This the naive optimism is not of zero utility.
Yeah.
But I would say, okay, so you're deeply flawed, deeply and tragically flawed and touched with evil. Well, yeah, you and everyone else. That's the first thing. So that doesn't uniquely characterize you. But you're capable of lifting yourself up beyond that. And so that's the thing. And so with the self-authoring program, we say, look, figure out where you are. You're a fixer-upper, man. It's not going to be a great realization, but take stock of where you are, and then understand that the fact that you're somewhere insufficient and dismal is an existential reality. It's true of everyone. So you don't have to be crushed with guilt or shame about that. And then regard yourself as someone who could improve and that has the capacity to do so. And then you can talk to yourself. It's like, well, it isn't whether or not you're bad. It's whether or not you're less bad than you were yesterday. And you can be. And that's a goal that can never stop giving. Like, you can always improve yourself some increment over your previous performance. And then instead of being the person who's bad or good even, you can be the person who's continually improving. And that's a meta good, right? It's better to be the person who's continually improving than it is to be the person that's good.
Would that ever work with a sociopath?
That's a good question. I don't like.
Almost as an exercise, kind of like, I know you don't feel anything for people, or you don't really, but it's almost like this would be useful to you. This would actually. What I like about how connected we're getting in the world is that sociopaths get found out pretty quickly, don't they? They do.
Even in the pre-electronic world, to be an effective psychopath, you had to keep moving.
He did, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So like the psychopath types they're kind of quasi-drifters because people figure them out. Yes. So and the psychopath idea isn't one I've ever been comfortable with, because it isn't that I'm naive enough to think that there aren't people in the world who are primarily malevolent. That's obvious. That's obvious.
They're just evil, right? There are some people that just get off on
they've oriented themselves. That's right. They've oriented themselves for one reason or another towards the
destruction,
the generation of suffering for the sake of suffering. They're artists of pain.
They're artists of pain.
Yeah, and there are definitely people like that. Now, whether they're born like that, born psychopaths, that's a harder one for me. I think that you have to be you probably have to be relatively brutally masculine by temperament, and then be badly socialized, and then make some terrible decisions to end up in that position. Because
it happens. Don't serial killers have different brains? Aren't their amygdalas a lot of times not as developed? Is that true?
Yeah, that we don't know enough about the brain. We don't know enough about brain structure at the proper level of detail to make claims like that.
Okay.
I mean, I know that literature really well because I studied aggression from a biological perspective for a long time, for like 15 years. And I was really interested in the neurological end of it. And there were claims that, that the antisocial types have impaired prefrontal function and that their emotional responses are different. And there's some truth to that, because if you look at temperamental traits, and people can do the understandmyself.com personality test if they want to find out about their traits. But one of the traits that fundamentally differentiates men from women is a trait called agreeableness. And men are less agreeable than women.
Don't say that. Don't say that at Google.
Yeah, no kidding. And it's true in Scandinavia, right? Most true in Scandinavia, where they've moved most to make the economic and social climate egalitarian. So it's biological.
Which is why there are 15 female nurses to 1 male nurse.
Yeah, right. And the same thing with engineers, except reversed. Yeah, and in Scandinavia, that's right. But don't say that at Google, because then you're a misogynist and a bigot and they'll fire you.
Yeah, well, what I love is that when you impose those sort of egalitarian values on a society the way Scandinavia has, it's amazing to see exactly how the biology reveals itself.
Yes, it is definitely amazing. No one would have guessed that. Like everyone assumed that as you flattened out the social environment, the biological differences would minimize, but they don't. They maximize.
Yeah.
So, okay, so back to agreeableness. So, what the best predictor from a personality perspective of whether or not you're going to be imprisoned is agreeableness. And the lower you are in agreeableness, the more likely you are to be imprisoned. And so you have men who are very low in agreeableness, very masculine, and who are very low in neuroticism. So they're very difficult to frighten. And they could easily become criminals.
Yes.
But if they're socialized properly, they don't become criminals at all. They become
race car drivers.
or staggeringly tough and admirable men.
Yes. Yeah.
So right. Because they're brave and immovable, both at the same time.
Oh yeah.
Tremendous character.
Sure. I mean, that's where you get your SEAL Team 6, your SWAT team, your cops that are decorated. Yeah, I mean that's right.
Exactly right. That's where you get people like Jocko Willink or Joe Rogan.
That's right.
They're tough as boots, those guys, and you don't scare them because they're just not scarable, and they could easily have drifted to the wrong side of things. And Jocko said as much to me, and so did Rogan. These guys know that perfectly well.
Yeah.
But just because you have the capacity for mayhem doesn't mean you have to exercise it. And one of the things I've been telling young men over the last year, over and over, is like, develop your capacity for mayhem. You should be dangerous. And
I agree 100%. That's why I think wrestling from a young age, for me, and then that's why I like combat sports, because it teaches you exactly how tough you're not. It also gives you respect. I don't know anybody. If you've been in a ring, you've been on a mat long enough, you can meet a guy who looks like he looks like the UPS delivery guy, and he can change your whole world. You're like, you don't even have any. You're just a big block of a man, and you're doing whatever you want to me. That sort of imposes a sense. It gives you a real sense of respect. You learn coming into contact with objective reality, which is what combat sports do. It does fundamentally change you for the better as you continue to do them. It first of all, it's very bonding with the men that you train with. It gives you confidence. It also makes you more afraid because you're aware that what violence can do. When you get cracked in the jaw, or you get knocked out, or you get put in a guillotine, you got to tap out immediately, or you're going to die, or you get choked to sleep, which is always happens when you roll enough in jiu-jitsu. Those kinds of things, the upside is it's almost all upside at the end of the day
if you keep at it.
Well, the comment on bonding is really interesting, because that's part of that example of becoming dangerous, but keeping it under control. And that's actually what makes a man respectable. It also makes a woman respectable, by the way, but that's a different story. But a man who's respectable is one that you shouldn't cross. but who conducts himself as a civilized entity impeccably, right? But both of those two things, it can't be that he's civilized because he's harmless and weak. Not helpful.
Right. And what I really love, one of the things I think is that we talk about the forefront of the feminist movement. You know, you can talk about books written on feminism, and I'm sure some of them are worthwhile, though I haven't read any. And then you can march for women's rights, and all of those things are viable ways of getting your voice out there. But I happen to believe, and the irony is that what has really changed a lot of sort of men like me, sort of, you know, has changed my chauvinistic heart, is watching women beat the shit out of each other in the octagon, watching women get as good as men in many instances, technically, with the way they throw knees and arms and their submission game and stuff like that, where watching women fight is as exciting as it is to watch men fight. That's a fact. And I'm a huge fight fan. And if you had told me that was to be the case 5 years ago, I would have told you to go back to Sweden. I would have insulted your manhood. I would have called you a communist or something like that. And now I scream at the TV. I can't believe it. It really has made me. It's made me have to contend with female power, hard power.
Because there are different kinds of
strength. Well, maybe the rule is. Maybe the rule is something like that. Instead of striving to create safe spaces, we should strive to be making everyone, male and female, alike as dangerous as possible.
Why not? At least give them a chance. I mean, these women have walked into the most male-dominated arenas in the world and said, "So can I." Me too. And that's impressive as hell. That really did change me. I kind of went, you know. But of course, in colleges, we have safe spaces where you are allowed to be kept away from even ideas that might contradict your
narrative.
That shows you see, when someone says you need a safe space and you need to be protected, they're basically saying you're helpless and infantile and there's no possible way you're ever going to transcend that.
Isn't that awful?
It is. It's the Oedipal mother. It's the devouring mother. It's absolutely awful.
Yeah, well, I'm going to read Eric Neumann's book on your recommendation. You were
talking about Paglia. That's a great book, man. That's a great book.
Yeah, I've read a lot of Paglia and stuff, and I've liked her over the years. Doctor, we've taken an hour and a half of your time, and I want to thank you because I really think you're such an important voice. I say this a lot on different podcasts, and I'm just very happy that you have this following, and I'm one of them.
Well, I'm really happy that we're able to have these conversations. Hey, if you email me, I'll set up a code for your watchers and your listeners so that they can get a discount on the self-authoring program and the personality program.
That's perfect. So will you email Hunter? You have Hunter Mott's email, don't you?
Yeah. Let me just make sure that I've got the right email here, but I believe I do.
Okay, and I'll give you mine as well. Or no, I'll email you. Don't worry. I'll do it.
Yeah, email me and I'll get this set up right away. Okay.
Okay, perfect. And what we'll do is we'll do a discount code for the self-authoring program. I've done it. I know a lot of the people in the mixed mental arts community have done it. I think it's invaluable, which is of course not a surprise, being that it's something that you've come up with. So, again, you do good work and stay healthy for God's sake.
Yeah, well, it's coming along. I'm in way better shape than I've been for, I would say, 3 or 4 years. So.
Well, we need you out.
Due to my daughter, she's figured it out, so good for her.
Good for her is right. Well, we need you out there, so thank you for everything you do. It's a privilege for me to speak to you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It was good to talk to you, and I'll get those codes to you as soon as you email me.
Sounds awesome. Thanks, Doctor.
You bet.
Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, Merry Christmas to you. I'll see you later. That was fucking awesome. Wasn't that great?